Mr. President, for nearly 2 years now, we've seen a devastating wave of home mortgage foreclosures all across America. Foreclosure exacts a painful toll on borrowers who cannot keep up with their payments. And let's not avoid the harsh realities. Foreclosure means that families, many oftentimes with young children, are forced out of their homes. It is a wrenching and emotionally devastating process. But we also need to appreciate that the broader economic consequences of all these foreclosures are overwhelmingly negative. The lender still loses money. The value of houses in the surrounding neighborhoods decline further. So-called toxic assets held by financial institutions and investors become even more toxic. And the financial system and the broader economy suffer further damage. This is totally counterproductive, as we have seen vividly over the last year. It simply makes no sense to continue down this failed path of massive home mortgage foreclosures. Mr. President, the Durbin Amendment offers a far more promising and productive approach. But keep in mind that foreclosure is a legal shorthand for a process that cuts off or extinguishes the ability of a borrower to pay debt and remain in the home. It literally, as the word is used, forecloses any other options. The Durbin Amendment, by contrast, encourages debtors and creditors to seek out and negotiate sensible, workable, and economically feasible options or alternatives. What Senator Durbin is proposing very faithfully applies the hard lessons learned as borrowers, lenders, and our nation work their way out of the agricultural credit crisis of the 1980s. Now, there are a lot of similarities between the farm crisis of the 1980s and the home mortgage and foreclosure crisis of today. In both instances, the value of the underlying assets, farmland in one case, houses in another, rose very steeply. And in both cases, debt secured by those underlying assets rose very rapidly also. In both situations, income available to pay off debt fell. Income fell. In the farm crisis, because of lower commodity prices. In the housing crisis, because of unemployment and lower wages and salaries. In both instances, the sort of asset bubble burst. It was not only a matter of being unable to make payments. The asset values could no longer support the loan. And with many farms, as now with many houses, the borrower owes much more than the real estate is mortgaged for. Now, so for a while in the farm crisis, both borrowers and lenders tried to ignore and deny what was totally an unsustainable situation. Eventually, some lenders relented and started working out new loan terms that would reschedule payments, modify interest rates, in some cases write down the debt a little bit. However, not all lenders would engage in that type of negotiation. For whatever reason, they did not want to recognize the economic reality that not all of the debt could be repaid and that there was not enough collateral value left to pay off the loan even if they went through foreclosure. So what happened is that Congress had to step in and bring a dose of reality to resolving the farm debt. It did so by enacting Chapter 12 to the Bankruptcy Code in 1986. I was here, a member of the Agriculture Committee at that time, working very diligently on trying to get through this farm credit crisis. But when we did that, Congress gave to family farms and ranches the debt restructuring remedy that had been available to other business enterprises. Chapter 12 bankruptcy permits the court to modify loans to family farmers, including those secured by a principal residence. Professor Neil Harrell of Iowa State University, one of the most respected agricultural economists in the nation, conducted authoritative studies of the impacts of Chapter 12 bankruptcy. One of the more significant findings by Professor Harrell was that some 84% of the original filers for Chapter 12 bankruptcy were still farming or owning agricultural land 7 years later. So this was an astonishingly successful outcome, exceeding the expectations of even the most enthusiastic supporters of Chapter 12 bankruptcy legislation. Professor Harrell also concluded that Chapter 12 provisions did not have a significant effect on interest rates. And now again, this was contrary to the dire predictions by many lenders at that time. The same dire predictions that we're hearing from lenders today. As Professor Harrell pointed out, both in the 1980s in the agricultural sector and in the 2007-2008 housing sector, the losses have already occurred because the borrowers who receive relief would otherwise have been unable to repay their loan. So again, Mr. President, we heard all these dire predictions of why we can't let the bankruptcy court come in and do something other than foreclose, to modify, to write down the debt a little bit, stretch out the time limits. What we did for many farmers at that time, Mr. President, they may have had high interest loans for 7 years, 10 years. We did. The courts came in and reduced the interest rates, strung out the payments for 20 years, 30 years. That's why, so many years later, farmers were still farming, because we knew that the underlying asset was still valuable. It was still productive. We just had to get through a bad, rough spot. And so there are a lot of farmers today still very much engaged in agriculture or ranching that would not be so today had we not enacted that Chapter 12 for agriculture in the mid-1980s. So, Mr. President, the provisions in the Durbin Amendment give powerful incentives to financial institutions to work constructively with those in financial difficulty. And indeed, by giving the bankruptcy judge authority to force modification to mortgages on primary residence, as they have the case to do with other assets, there's a real incentive to come to terms. For instance, I have never been one. I've never really understand why a bankruptcy judge can force modifications on other assets, but not on your primary residence. Well, we had the same situation in the 1980s, and we extended it to farms, and as I said, Professor Harrell showed the rest is history. It succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. By giving this authority, again, to the bankruptcy judge, as I said, there's an incentive for both the financial institution and the borrower to come to some terms. Now, this is very helpful for a person in difficulty, and it's very often in the interest of the owner of the mortgage, though, admittedly, it's not always in the interest of the mortgage servicer. Mr. President, we want to give relief to homeowners facing foreclosure, not just for their benefit, but for our benefit. For our benefit, the benefit of our economy. So I urge my colleagues to support the Durbin Amendment. Again, as we saw during the Chapter 12 bankruptcy proceedings during the farm crisis in the 1980s, these provisions will allow many people to retain their homes and to weather this terrible economic downturn. Generally speaking, lenders will not lose any money that they would not already stand to lose if they were to force foreclosure. As I said, I believe there is a very correct and almost similar parallel to what we did in the 1980s with farms. You know, people that are in financial difficulty today because of the downturn in the economy are going to be productive workers in the future. Why force them out of their homes when a modification, stretching out of payments, reduction of interest rates, could keep them in their homes, keep the value of the surrounding property up around them so we don't get in this downward spiral in our communities? To me, this makes eminently good sense. Also, the positive consequences for our economy would be profound. An estimated 1.7 million families would be able to avoid foreclosure and keep their homes. Housing prices, I said, would receive much needed support. The housing market would be able to stabilize. And all of this would be a much-needed tonic for our economy. So I commend Senator Durbin for always being on the leading edge of this, as he has been in the past. This is an amendment that I don't know why it isn't just accepted. It should be adopted overwhelmingly. As I said, we have a precedence for it. We know what happened in the past. And we know the same thing applies today. So I urge my colleagues to wholeheartedly support the Durbin Amendment for individual homeowners, for communities, but for our overall economy. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.